We are in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, one of the key states that hold the key to who will win the next election. And I'm here right now at a canvassing activity for Kamala Harris. There you can see a lot of volunteers being trained right now. They're being given the literature. They're being told how to go about doing this door-to-door campaigning for one of their candidates. And of course for Kamala Harris. Talking to me about how this adds up, what has been the kind of work that the community has been doing, and which candidate matters in this community. I have Mohan Seshadri, who is the Executive Director of AAPI. Thank you so much, Mohan, for speaking to NDTV. And talk to us firstly about what is really happening here. What's this canvassing activity happening? I see about like 50, 60 volunteers?
Yeah, I would say in total we have 80 volunteers launching this morning. We've especially concentrated on making sure we have Indian American volunteers because we're right here in a heavily Indian American neighborhood and community in Bensalem, a town in the Philly suburbs.
Yeah.
We also specifically recruited a local Indian American candidate, Anand Patel, from the local Gujarati community to run for the state legislature, the state representative here in Bensalem. And so we're out here knocking doors and getting out the vote, not just for Vice President Kamala Harris for the presidency, but also for Anand Patel. We're a year-round organization here at AAPI. We work all across Pennsylvania in every Asian American community in 22 different languages, and we specifically focus on every level of the ballot, not just the national elections, but also the local ones.
The local ones, and which is what I want to ask you, that, you know, a lot of people in India, for them this election is about Harris versus Trump. But that's just one layer of the American democracy at play. Absolutely. What is happening right now is grassroots level election as well, coinciding with 5th of November presidential election. Explain to us, you know, the community that we are in right now, this neighborhood, the importance of the candidate that you're backing, and how this sort of adds up to the national election.
Absolutely. So first, it's important to note that these days, after 200 to 400 years of Asian Americans and Indian Americans being on this land, our community across the state, the Asian American vote, is the margin of victory in statewide elections in Pennsylvania, which means that whichever candidate wins the Asian vote in Pennsylvania, they will win Pennsylvania and therefore the White House. And that's why our work is so important, to turn out all of our voters in all of the languages our community speaks. But we're also the margin of victory in local elections all across Pennsylvania. And while the White House and the presidency is important to us, these local
elections are equally important.
Exactly. They affect our community's day-to-day lives. They affect workers' rights. They affect environmental protections. They affect healthcare access. They affect things like roads and bridges and, you know, which buildings are getting repaired and things like that. And we've especially seen how much our communities are excited to turn out for a member of our community, which is why we've recruited someone from our community to run in this local election.
You mentioned that the Asian American, I would say the Indian American vote is essentially that X factor between victory and defeat right now. If you could give some numbers in this neighborhood, what is that, the size of the community, and also any other matrix that you have in terms of economic growth, college degree, median household income, anything that you can help us with.
So I can say statewide, in 2020, when it was Biden versus Trump that first time around, we went out and we doubled the Asian American turnout in Pennsylvania. That doubling provided President Biden with his margin of victory. Previously, the Asian vote had been between 40,000 and 60,000 members of our community turning out. We mobilized between 100 and 120,000 voters to turn out, and that surge provided President Biden with the 80,000 votes that he needed to win in Pennsylvania in 2020. So we played the same role in the statewide elections in 22, and we're excited to do the same thing. It's important to note that overwhelmingly Asian Americans, and specifically Indian Americans, are voting for Vice President Kamala Harris at 75 to 80% margins. But that means that it's not just about persuading our voters to vote for the candidate it's about getting them to the polls. Exactly.
And I want to ask you about, you know, what exactly is that training that's happening there right now? You've got your volunteers being trained into how to get those voters into the booth, or is it something else?
It's about reminding them how important the election is. It's about reminding them how to vote and where to vote.
Yes.
What we found is a lot of our voters in particular, they know which candidate stands for them, they know which candidate fights for them. That doesn't mean that they have been informed where their polling place is or what time they should actually get out to the polls, as well as the legal rules
voter
affecting their vote.
awareness
Exactly.
and
yes.
that
so
kind of
we do the
programs.
political education, but also the basic civic education that especially our elders, our aunties and uncles, too many members of our community have not been informed by government or the parties. And so we play that crucial role filling in that gap, making sure our communities have as much access to democracy as any other American does.
And if we were to speak about Pennsylvania, about Philadelphia, you mentioned that the Indian American community, Asian American community is essentially the difference between victory and defeat.
Absolutely.
The next 3 to 4 days are very critical, actually just about 3 days.
Yeah.
Any now plan for the last leg? What's the last push going to be like?
Overall, I can say up until, so far this year, by the end of this election, we'll have knocked on 300,000 doors in Asian American communities in 22 languages all across Pennsylvania. We'll have made up to 6 million phone calls in 22 languages all across Pennsylvania. We've sent over 1 million pieces of direct mail to people's households with the faces of our local community leaders, urging them to vote for the candidates that we and they are supporting in 10 languages. And so right now it's all about keeping up that pressure, keeping our foot on the gas and making sure that we're finishing strong.
So this is just one of those meetings that you are holding. How many such meetings you're holding?
So right now we have 80 volunteers launching from here. We have 50 to 60 volunteers launching from Philly in a heavily Chinese community. We have volunteers and paid canvassers knocking doors in Pittsburgh as well. In Allegheny County on the other side of the state, we're a statewide year-round operation. And so both our staff and our volunteers, we're talking about hundreds of people on the doors, knocking thousands of doors every single day. And that's only growing and building as we head towards the finish line.
Okay, so, but you mentioned that, and some statistic, I was just having a look, this is national statistic, not just Philadelphia, which is that, about out of those born outside the US, 70% entered the country after 2000. Between 2010 and 2020, Indian American community has grown by 50%. It's now the second largest immigrant community. And most importantly, men under 40 that are born in the US are more inclined towards voting for Trump. Essentially, that's the demographic that the Republican Party has been able to break into. How do you see it? Someone who's been, canvassing and mobilizing people on ground to vote for the Democrat Party. What has been your response like to the kind of inroads that the Republican Party has made into the Indian American vote base in the last couple of years?
Yeah. I'll say that one thing is, frankly, for all of the national rhetoric about this inroads, we're not necessarily seeing it on the ground in Pennsylvania. They may be seeing it on the ground in other states, but in Pennsylvania, 75% of the people we talk to, including, for example, Indian men, are excited to vote for Kamala Harris, as are their entire families. We're absolutely seeing a huge surge of excitement among Desi women who are excited to elect the first South Asian woman to the White House. But just because Indian women are so incredibly excited and are excited to turn out, are surging in terms of their voter turnout, it doesn't mean that Indian American men are not voting for Harris. It just means that, there has been an explicit targeting by the Republican Party of men in general. So we're seeing that across the board in terms of this gender gap. But when it comes to our community, the Indian American community, the Asian American community, overwhelmingly, a vast majority of all of our communities are going for Vice President Harris and for the candidates we're supporting down ballot as well.
Okay, and the final question, Mohan, that I want to ask you is that the number one issue on which you think the Indian American community is actually going to vote, what is that?
I would say it's a couple things. One, gun violence and gun violence prevention, especially the roles that guns have played not just in school shootings, but in anti-Asian and anti-Indian violence over the last couple of years. Our communities are aligned in backing candidates who support common sense gun violence prevention reform. We've seen that overwhelmingly. The cost of living and the economy is huge for our voters, but overall, our communities want an economy that works for everybody, not just the 1%, not just millionaires and billionaires, billionaires who are going to get tax breaks from the Trump administration, but middle class and working class families who need support in order to make sure that they have equal access to opportunity. And lastly, the environment. Our communities have a huge reverence for the environment. Our communities consistently vote in favor of candidates who are going to support clean air and clean water. We can see around us, what happens and the environments that our communities want to live in.
Yes.
Our communities want a future in which our children can breathe clean air and drink fresh water.
Yes.
And we're seeing, again, our communities consistently support candidates who they trust to acknowledge that climate change is a real thing,
Right.
who's going to back pro-science policies, and above all else are going to keep our families safe from pollution and other environmental harm.
All right, Mohan, thank you so much for speaking to NDTV and taking, making us see what really is the grassroots level political campaign that takes place and get an inside, view of American democracy at play. Thank you so much
Thank you for covering our work.
Thank you.